Imagine drawing one line through almost 75 years of history. At one end stands Adolf Hitler, dictator of Nazi Germany. At the other stands Kanye West, one of the most famous and controversial musicians of the 21st century. They seem to belong to completely different universes. Yet a chain of documented face-to-face connections can link them in just 6 steps. Adolf Hitler to Edward VIII. Edward VIII to Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan to Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson to Jay-Z. And Jay-Z to Kanye West. This is a striking example of the idea commonly called 6 degrees of separation, or, more casually, the theory of 6 handshakes. But before we follow the chain, there is an important rule. A connection does not mean friendship, approval, or shared beliefs. It only means that 2 people genuinely met or had a direct personal relationship. In a chain that stretches from a dictator to a pop star, that distinction matters. The basic idea is simple. Think of humanity as an enormous network. Every person is a dot, or node. Every direct acquaintance is a line connecting 2 dots. You know your family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, and perhaps a few people from school. Each of them has a different set of contacts. Those circles overlap, and a single well-connected person can form a bridge between worlds that otherwise appear impossibly distant. The idea predates social media by decades. In 1929, Hungarian writer Frigyes Karinthy imagined a world made smaller by modern travel and communication. The concept later became famous through psychologist Stanley Milgram's small world experiments in the 1960s. Participants were asked to send a folder toward a stranger, but they could pass it only to someone they personally knew. In the best-known published study by Jeffrey Travers and Milgram, 296 people started chains aimed at a target in Massachusetts. Only 64 chains actually arrived, and those successful chains contained an average of 5.2 intermediaries. That result is fascinating, but it is not a magical law proving that every human being is always exactly 6 steps from every other. Most of the chains failed. The experiment studied particular groups in the United States, not every person on Earth. 6 degrees is better understood as a memorable description of the small world effect. Large social networks can contain surprisingly short routes. Our chain begins in Bavaria on the 22nd of October 1937. Edward VIII had been king of the United Kingdom for less than a year before abdicating in December 1936. He gave up the throne amid a constitutional crisis over his plan to marry Wallis Simpson. After the abdication, he became the Duke of Windsor. Less than a year later, Edward and Wallis toured Nazi Germany. The visit ended at Hitler's mountain residence, the Berghof, near Berchtesgaden. Contemporary photographs show Hitler greeting the Duke and Duchess, and archival descriptions identify the men shaking hands. Reports from the time said the meeting and conversation lasted roughly 2 hours. So the first link is not rumor or a vague overlap at some enormous public event. Adolf Hitler and the former Edward VIII stood together, spoke, and were photographed at Hitler's home. That gives us handshake number 1. Now jump forward 33 years. On the 4th of April, 1970, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor visited the White House. Richard Nixon was President of the United States, and he and First Lady Pat Nixon hosted a formal dinner for the couple. White House photographs show Nixon standing and speaking with Edward and Wallis. The Nixon Presidential Library also preserves records connected to the dinner. The contrast is already bizarre. One man in the photograph had met the dictator who led Nazi Germany. The other was the sitting American president during the Vietnam War. Edward acts as a historical bridge between the Europe of the 1930s and Washington in the 1970s. That is handshake number 2, Edward VIII to Richard Nixon. The next connection is much less surprising. Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan were major figures in the same political party during the same era. Reagan became governor of California in 1967, 2 years before Nixon entered the White House. They appeared at political events together, communicated directly, and met in person. The Nixon Library's records list numerous conversations involving both men. A White House telephone log records a call between Nixon and Reagan on the 9th of June, 1971. Other records place Reagan with Nixon in the Oval Office and at Republican events. Their relationship included cooperation, rivalry, and disagreement, but there is no doubt that they personally knew one another. Handshake number 3 therefore carries us from the Nixon administration to the man who would become president in 1981, Ronald Reagan. Then the chain leaves electoral politics and enters pop culture. On the 14th of May, 1984, Michael Jackson visited the White House. At that moment, Jackson was not merely successful. Thriller had become a cultural phenomenon, and he was probably the most famous entertainer on the planet. Reagan presented him with a plaque recognizing his lifetime achievement and his support for a national campaign against drunk driving. Official photographs from the Reagan Presidential Library show President Reagan, Nancy Reagan, and Michael Jackson talking in the Blue Room. Reagan praised Jackson's contribution to the campaign, while Jackson thanked the president and spoke briefly about the issue. The event also shows why famous people create such powerful shortcuts in a social network. A president meets governors, diplomats, business leaders, athletes, actors, and musicians. A global performer meets artists, politicians, executives, and activists. When two such hubs meet, their already enormous networks become connected. That White House ceremony gives us handshake number 4, Ronald Reagan to Michael Jackson. The fifth connection happened on a very different stage. In 2001, Jay-Z headlined Hot 97's Summer Jam in New York. The performance became legendary in hip-hop history, partly because Jay-Z debuted material aimed at his rivals. But then he produced a surprise no diss track could match. He brought Michael Jackson onto the stage. Footage and photographs show the two artists together in front of the crowd. Hot 97's own retrospective confirms that Jay-Z introduced Jackson during the set, and Jay-Z later described the appearance as one of the great highlights of his career. They were also connected musically when Jay-Z appeared on a remix of Jackson's You Rock My World. Michael Jackson therefore becomes another bridge. Through Reagan, he reaches the political world of the 1980s. Through Jay-Z, he reaches the hip-hop world of the 2000s. That is handshake number 5. The final link is the easiest to document because it developed into a long creative partnership. Before Kanye West became a superstar rapper, he built his reputation as a producer. He produced music for Jay-Z, including tracks associated with the landmark 2001 album The Blueprint. Jay-Z helped give Kanye access to a much larger stage, while Kanye's sound helped reshape Jay-Z's music. Their relationship grew through guest appearances, live performances, and years of collaboration. In 2011, they released the joint album Watch the Throne and toured together as a co-headlining act. Their relationship later became complicated and publicly strained, but even conflict demonstrates that this was never a distant technical association. They worked together closely and knew one another personally. Handshake number 6 brings us to Kanye West. Now look back at the entire route. Hitler met Edward in 1937. Edward met Nixon in 1970. Nixon knew Reagan. Reagan met Michael Jackson in 1984. Jackson appeared with Jay-Z in 2001. Jay-Z became Kanye West's collaborator and mentor. 6 direct links cross dictatorship, monarchy, the American presidency, pop, and hip-hop. The chain spans people born in 5 different decades, and its first meeting occurred 60 years before Kanye released his earliest professional productions. But what does this really prove? It does not prove that 6 is a universal maximum. It does not prove that every link is socially equal. Meeting someone once at a formal ceremony is different from working with someone for years, and this chain was assembled backward after all the meetings had already happened. We selected unusually famous, highly connected people, which makes the route easier to find. What it does demonstrate beautifully is how networks shrink distance. Society is not organized like a neat row of separate generations. It is built from overlapping circles. Royalty overlaps with politics. Politics overlaps with entertainment. Entertainment overlaps with the next generation of artists. A few people function as bridges, carrying the chain across decades and professions. The phrase 6 handshakes can also be misleading because a literal handshake is not required. Milgram's experiment was about personal acquaintances, someone you actually know well enough to contact. For a historical chain, photographs, official schedules, recorded conversations, performances, and collaborations can provide stronger evidence than an unseen handshake. There is also a mathematical intuition behind the small world effect. If every person introduced you to 100 completely new people, your network would grow explosively. 100 contacts, then 10,000 contacts of contacts, then 1 million at the next step. Real life is messier because many circles overlap. Your coworkers may know one another, and your relatives may share the same neighbors.